They fired me on camera in front of 40 people, and not one of them knew that by sunrise, 3 of them would be begging me for their jobs back. Welcome back to the Ethan Files. My name is Cole, and this is the story of how I let a billionaire humiliate me on national footage because I needed him to believe he'd already won. The rain hadn't started yet, but the sky over the city looked like it was holding its breath. I'd been mopping the marble floor of Halcyon Tower's 40th floor lobby for 11 months. Nobody looked at me twice. Grey uniform, 2 sizes too big, head down, answering to a name that wasn't mine. That morning, CEO Marcus Reeve walked in, flanked by 6 board members and a documentary crew hired to film a day in the life of visionary leadership. He was 38, sharp-suited, the kind of man who smiles with his teeth but never his eyes. I was on my knees working a coffee stain out of the tile when his shoe nearly caught my bucket. He snapped at me to watch it, loud enough for the cameras. Then, because an audience was watching and cruelty plays well when it's dressed up as discipline, he turned to HR and said he'd watched this janitor do sloppy work for months, that Halcyon was rebuilding its image starting today, and that rebuilding started with basic competence at every level. Terminate him, now, in front of everyone. The lobby went silent. I rose slowly, mop still in my hand, and looked at Marcus for 3 long seconds, a look so calm it unsettled the whole room more than tears ever could have. "Understood, sir." I folded my apron, set it on the reception desk like I was laying down something far heavier than fabric, and walked out into the rain. Nobody in that lobby knew my real name was Daniel Coleman Whitfield III. And that my grandfather's signature was on the original incorporation papers of the company Marcus Reeve now ran like he'd built it himself. 3 years earlier, I'd been the youngest VP in Halcyon's history, inside a company my grandfather built from a single Ohio print shop into an $11 billion empire. Then my father died in a car accident on a wet mountain road that got investigated and closed in 2 weeks, despite details that never added up. An inspection record too clean, a gap in the security footage, a toxicology report that came back too fast. I buried my father and told myself it was just an accident. Then a forensic accountant I'd quietly hired turned up irregularities buried in the shipping fraud division. Padded invoices, phantom vendors, money bleeding out through shell companies in 3 countries. The trail didn't point at some stranger. It pointed at Marcus Reeve, then the rising COO, and at my own uncle, Halcyon's chairman, Whitman Cole, the man who'd mentored Marcus like the son he never had. I raised it quietly with the board. I was met with silence, then sabotage. Documents vanished overnight. My accountant got reassigned overseas. I understood, with the sick clarity of a man watching a trap close, that if I pushed harder from inside the company, I'd be discredited, sued or worse, and the evidence would disappear with me. So I did something nobody expected. I disappeared on my own terms. Resigned for personal reasons. Let everyone assume grief had broken me. For 18 months, I worked 100 small, invisible jobs, rebuilding the paper trail from the outside, bank records, offshore filings, sworn testimony from 2 employees Whitman had quietly destroyed. Then, using a contact from my father's old network, I got myself hired as a janitor at Halcyon Tower, under a fake name, not to clean floors, to watch. The only person who recognized me was Elena Reeve, Marcus's 24-year-old daughter, who worked in marketing and had met me years ago at a gala, back when I was a name in the society pages instead of a ghost in grey coveralls. She spotted me in week 2, nearly dropped her coffee, cornered me in a stairwell, and demanded to know what I was doing there. I told her half the truth, old financial discrepancies, nothing more. I never told her the trail led straight to her father. Over the months, an alliance formed. Elena had always sensed something cold about how fast her father climbed the same year her uncle got pushed into early retirement. Believing she was helping expose ordinary corporate corruption, she started feeding me small details. Rearranged meetings, files being shredded instead of archived, vendors that quietly stopped getting audited. She had no idea she was building the case that would destroy her own father. That's the part people later assumed was calculated cruelty on my end, using a daughter against her family. The truth is messier. I spent months looking for a version of this that wouldn't break something she loved. I never found one. The night I got fired on camera, Eleanor found me in a rented studio apartment with my father's old briefcase spread open on the table. Shipping manifests, wire transfers, and a signed 2019 memo in Marcus's own handwriting authorizing a restructuring of the fraud detection team the same month the phantom vendors first appeared. "You're not just some janitor," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I told her. "My name is Daniel Whitfield. My grandfather founded this company. Your father built his career on top of a theft that probably killed mine." She sat down hard and said nothing for a long time, then told me I needed to prove all of it, because if I was wrong, she'd never forgive me, and if I was right, she didn't know if she could forgive him. What neither of us knew yet was that the real architect wasn't Marcus at all. It was Whitman Cole, my own uncle, who'd recruited Marcus specifically because he was hungry enough to execute the scheme and naive enough to think he was being rewarded for loyalty instead of positioned to take the fall. Marcus signed real damning documents, but every truly dirty transaction traced one layer further back into accounts only Whitman controlled. Marcus was guilty of cruelty and cowardice. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the villain everyone in the room could see. Whitman was the one nobody suspected, the same uncle who used to bounce me on his knee at family dinners. 6 days after the footage of my firing went viral, Halcyon held an emergency shareholder meeting. Marcus thought he was walking in to manage a PR disaster. He didn't know I'd spent those 6 days quietly reactivating a dormant 12% founding family share block, sitting untouched in trust since my father's death because everyone assumed the Whitfield line was done with this company. 12% wasn't controlling, but combined with 3 institutional investors I'd spent 18 invisible months building trust with, it was enough to force a full forensic audit onto the agenda. Marcus stood to object. I stood up from the back of the room, still in my grey uniform, and walked to the front while the whole hall gasped. "Half of you fired me from this room without a hearing," I said. "I'm going to give you one anyway." I laid it all out. The shells, the phantom vendors, the memo with Marcus's signature, and watched his face drain the colour of the marble I used to mop. Then I turned to the empty chair at the head of the table. "Whitman Cole isn't here today. Convenient, since every wire transfer in this file routes back to an account only he's ever had signing authority over. Marcus followed orders. Whitman gave them. Security found Whitman 2 hours later at a private airfield, boarding a jet with no return flight booked. Marcus wasn't cleared. He'd known enough, signed enough, humiliated enough people for the cameras that the board voted him out within the week. But he wasn't the monster the footage made him look like. He was a man who climbed a ladder built by someone crueler than himself and never once asked who was holding it steady. Whitman went down harder. The forensic audit that followed took 11 weeks and traced over $400 million diverted through the Shell network, funding a private art collection, a second home in a country with no extradition treaty, and political donations that kept certain investigations conveniently stalled. He was caught 11 days after his failed escape and eventually sentenced to 18 years, including a charge tied to the falsified inspection records from my father's accident, a charge I fought for personally for almost a year because some debts aren't about money. I took my grandfather's old office on the 40th floor. I kept the folded grey apron from the day I got fired right there on a shelf behind my desk. When a reporter asked why, I told her, because everyone in that lobby thought they knew exactly who I was, and I want to remember every single day how easy it is to be wrong about a person just because they're holding a mop instead of a title. That's the part of the story most people online never learn. They see the clip, they assume it ends with an apology. It doesn't. It ends with a signature 3 generations later, finally back where it always belonged. But that's not where I stopped this story last time, because the real fight wasn't over the day Whitman got arrested. It was only getting started. 7 weeks into the chaos, while the audit was still running and Halcyon's stock had cratered, a rival named Victor Ashworth, CEO of Braxton Meridian Holdings, smelled blood. He'd built his entire career buying wounded companies at their weakest moment, and he started quietly buying up our shares through intermediary funds, staying just under the disclosure threshold. By the time he was forced to file, he controlled 9%, enough to go public with an open letter, proposing the board replace our scandal-plagued leadership with his own turnaround team. Rescue, he called it. I called it a vulture circling a wounded family legacy. He was betting institutional investors would rather trust an experienced predator than a 29-year-old ex-janitor with a bizarre personal history. It was Rosalind Achebe, a board member Whitman had spent 9 years quietly overruling and dismissing, who saved us. She knew the same 3 investors who backed me at the shareholder meeting could be persuaded to hold the line, but only if I proved my reforms would actually make the company more profitable, not just more just. For 11 straight days, Rosalind, our compliance lead Priya, and I built the most detailed restructuring plan Halcyon had ever produced. $60 million a year recoverable just from killing the shell vendor network, plus real numbers on how a whistleblower system would slash our exposure to exactly the kind of fraud that had just cost us billions. Ashworth tried one last move, offering shareholders a 15% premium buyout. But once our 3 key investors saw real numbers instead of just a sympathetic story, they publicly reaffirmed their support. Ashworth's takeover died within days. He sold his stake 8 months later at a loss and told a reporter he'd underestimated how fast a credible plan could close the window he thought he had months to exploit. Here's something most people don't know either. Priya Nandakumar, the internal auditor who'd flagged 3 of the phantom vendors 4 years before I ever came looking, had her original report vanish from the system within a week of filing it. She got quietly demoted to reviewing janitorial supply expense reports, a title change dressed up so no formal complaint could stick. 3 years, raising 2 kids alone, terrified to speak again, until I found her through an old university connection and spent 4 evenings just listening before she agreed to put any of it in writing. Terence Boyle got fired outright after refusing to sign off on numbers that didn't add up. 2 years unemployed, blacklisted across the entire regional industry because Whitman made 2 phone calls to make sure of it. When I told him plainly I believed his firing was retaliation connected to a fraud that likely killed my father, he said he'd been waiting 3 years for someone to believe him. Elena's own reckoning with her father took longer than anyone's. She didn't speak to him for months. When he finally wrote her a letter, not asking forgiveness outright, just laying out plainly how watching his own father get discarded by a heartless factory convinced him the only alternative to being discarded was becoming the kind of man who discards others first. She read it twice and put it in a drawer, not ready to answer, not sure she ever would be. 6 months later, she agreed to one supervised conversation in a public garden neither of them had history with. He asked her what she actually remembered from childhood, not the vacations, the ordinary days. She told him about being 9 with a fever and him cancelling a business dinner to read to her from a book neither of them could later agree on the title of. He'd completely forgotten that evening until she gave it back to him. Nothing was fixed in that garden, but something started. Whitman wrote me twice from prison. I never wrote back, but I read every word. The first letter traced his whole downfall back to one early humiliation decades before any of us were born. A chairman publicly dismissing one of his ideas in front of the board the moment he privately decided he'd rather be feared and untouchable than respected and occasionally overruled. The second letter, years later, asked only one thing, that I preserve an honest account of exactly how the fraud worked, not to excuse it, but so some future chairman might recognize the same warning signs in themselves before it metastasized into what he'd built. I never answered him directly, but that account is in our training materials now for every new executive who walks through this building.
I visited him once in the detention facility before the plea deal closed. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him without the tailored suits and the practiced smile. He asked me flatly if I'd meant to bring the company back under Whitfield control from the start, or if that was just a convenient outcome of trying to expose the fraud. I told him the truth. For most of those 18 months, I only wanted to prove what happened to my father. Only in the final weeks did I let myself actually want it back. He told me he never believed a Whitfield could rebuild what he'd spent 30 years dismantling, and that watching me do exactly that from across a prison table was the first time in decades anyone had genuinely surprised him. I drove home without the closure I'd hoped for. Some kinds of harm just don't resolve into anything as clean as forgiveness. The civil case tied to my father's death took almost 4 years longer than Whitman's criminal trial. But a court eventually found to a civil standard, not the higher criminal one, that the accident that killed my father was very likely deliberate tampering, not mechanical failure. I used part of that settlement to start a scholarship in his name for students studying forensic accounting. The exact discipline that ended up bringing his killers to justice. 5 years in, one of the recipients wrote in her application that the Halcyon case was the entire reason she chose the field. I read that application personally. It broke something open in me that the courtroom never touched. Marcus, stripped of his severance and barred for life from serving as an officer of any public company, moved 2 hours outside the city into a house smaller than anything he'd lived in for 15 years. A local community college betting that a man who'd lived through the exact failure of ethical judgment might teach it better than any textbook offered him one evening class on business ethics. His first sessions were brutal. Working adults, many older than him, asked him questions no boardroom ever dared. 3 years in, that one small class had become something of a local institution. Elena sat in the back of one session, unannounced, and watched him field a hard question from a former factory worker about whether ethical business was even possible under shareholder return pressure, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt proud of something he'd built instead of just relieved he'd survived it. 5 years after that shareholder meeting, Halcyon barely resembled the company Marcus once ran. Revenue grew steady instead of explosive deliberately because the aggressive growth targets Whitman once demanded were exactly the pressure that made fraud feel necessary in the first place. Terrence's whistleblower office grew to 11 people across every country we operated in, and its first public transparency report documented 17 separate cases of retaliation that even I hadn't expected. Priya rose to chief compliance officer, reporting straight to the board instead of through executive management, closing the exact loophole that once let her original warning get buried. I kept that gray apron on the shelf the whole time. Its meaning shifted for me from a raw reminder of humiliation into something closer to a private discipline, something I'd glance at before hard decisions, asking myself if the choice in front of me would look defensible to the man who once knelt on that lobby floor, not knowing if any of this would ever work. 4 years in, the system got tested in a way I didn't expect. A senior executive named Gregory Voss, hired specifically to help build our new culture of accountability, one of the loudest public champions of it, got reported anonymously through our own whistleblower system for quietly taking credit for junior employees' work while undermining anyone who threatened to outshine him. My first instinct was disbelief. He was supposed to be exactly the kind of leader the new Halcyon produced. It took me days to realize that exact instinct. The reluctance to seriously investigate someone who'd earned trust through loud advocacy was the same psychological blind spot that let Whitman operate for 30 years. I insisted on a full independent investigation with the same rigor as the original fraud audit. 6 separate junior employees corroborated the pattern. Voss was terminated quietly, with more dignity than my own firing ever got, because I wanted to prove accountability and basic decency were never actually in tension. That case did more to build real trust in the company than any single policy ever had, because it proved the system worked even against the people most visibly waving its flag. 10 years out, the board raised the obvious question, was it still healthy for a company that had barely survived one family's unchecked power to keep being run by the same family's direct descendant, however reformed? I didn't fight it. I'd been waiting 2 years for someone to ask. We ran an 18-month fully independent succession process outside search firm, forensic-style background checks on every candidate, internal or not. The board chose Deborah Osei, who joined 6 years earlier and built her whole reputation on exactly the kind of unglamorous operational competence my own 18 months in warehouses taught me to value over almost anything else. I stayed on the board, focused only on the whistleblower framework and governance reforms, deliberately stepping out of the singular seat of power that once made Whitman's fraud possible in the first place. Once a year, 6 of us who lived through it, me, Elena, Rosalind, Priya, Terrence, and Ruth Alvarez, the warehouse supervisor who taught me more about operational truth during my invisible year than any executive ever had, still get dinner at a quiet restaurant near the tower. 10 years in, Ruth raised her glass and said she'd spent 30 years believing nobody above a certain floor would ever care what she actually knew, and that the strangest gift of her whole career was living long enough to watch that stop being true, not because of some grand policy, but because a frightened man with a fake name once needed her help on a loading dock and never forgot it. Terrence said the hardest part was never the fraud itself, but unlearning the quiet self-doubt Whitman planted in anyone who threatened to expose him, the sense that maybe you imagined the injustice, maybe you just weren't good enough. Priya said she thought of her own kids, and the proof she'd left them that telling an inconvenient truth to power, even when it costs everything at first, can still end up mattering. Rosalind closed it, like she always does, without a toast, just an observation. Every person at that table had once been someone nobody in power thought was worth listening to. An auditor with a demoted title, a logistics manager blacklisted on a rumor, a warehouse supervisor no one in a suit ever asked a real question, a board member outvoted politely for 9 straight years, and a janitor on his knees with a mop 3 seconds away from the biggest decision of his life. The whole recovery of an $11 billion company came down to nothing more sophisticated than a handful of people finally taking each other seriously when almost nobody else in the building would. The clip of my firing still circulates. Most people who share it never learn the rest, and they assume it ends with an apology. It doesn't. It ends with a signature, back where it belonged, and a decision, remade every single ordinary day since, to build power that protects the people underneath it, instead of punishing them. If this is the first Ethan Files story you've heard, my name's Cole, and there's more where this came from. Please subscribe for more stories.